Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner, and today we are going to discuss about the international regulation for the hazardous substances and process. And in this lecture, we will try to look at a very holistic understanding and view of the regulation of the hazardous substances and processes as it has been ordained by the international environmental law in general and international hazardous substances regulation law in particular. We will try to have a very panoramic perception that as to how the international legal framework ultimately resulted into a very effective regulatory framework for the hazardous substances and processes, and we are trying to see that what are the different kind of the regulations which have been put into practice and vogue, and it resulted into a very comprehensive framework to guide the international community and all the states of the world to face the challenges and to control the formidable challenges of the proliferation of the hazardous waste and substances. In this category, dear learner and viewer, we are going to see that what are the environmental implications of the hazardous waste, how the hazardous waste are to be defined and to be understood, what its ambit and scopes happens to be. We will try to reflect upon the categories of the hazardous waste which has been identified under the Basel Convention 1989. At the same time, having devoted to some of the salient features of one of the most prominent convention on the hazardous waste, the first convention or the very comprehensive convention to quote is the Basel Convention on the Transboundary Movement of the Hazardous Waste passed in 1989. We'll be also looking as a very panoramic perception of the entire laws relating to the hazardous substances and processes, and in that reference we will try to dwell on the issue of international legal framework on hazardous substances. Besides the Basel Convention, there are a series of conventions which also try to address the question of the regulation of hazardous industries, hazardous waste, its movement, its transboundary movement, its import, export, and storage, handling, and transportation. So we come across the Loam Convention 1992-2000, and we have also a convention relating to the hazardous industries or hazardous processes and pursuit known as the Bamko Convention, though this convention has a limited sense of reference to the African countries. We'll be also dwelling on the Stockholm Convention 2001. We will be also taking note of the Rotterdam Convention of 2002. And then, after having a cursory glance over the international development, international regulation of the hazardous industries, hazardous processes, hazardous substances, into we will switch over to the Indian law as to how the Indian law happens to be very quick enough to frame its rule right from the enactment and promulgation of the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of the Hazardous Waste in 1989. That's why we see under the Environment Protection Act 1986, if any notification which have received its first attention was the compliance of the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement, which resulted into issue of the three detailed notification in regard to the hazardous waste, management and handling, storage and transportation, import, export issues of the hazardous waste in Indian context. In the subsequent lecture, we will be devoting to the Indian aspect of the law. In this lecture, we are exclusively devoting ourselves to understand the international legal framework for the hazardous substances and process. Having said so, we are going to see that how the environmental implication of the hazardous waste have drawn the attention of the ecologist and the planner and the legislature at the global level. What we see that the modern industrialization and consumerism have increased hazardous waste generation, and that generation starts from chemical to plastic to pesticide to paints to batteries and textile. So this is the category, and the category is very long, that this category appears to be very comprehensive in the sense that in our pursuit to not only industrialization at the one hand, But the consumerism, on the other hand, we see that it has resulted into proliferation and generation of the West, and most of the West are having a very hazardous waste, and it is evident from the chemical, plastic, pesticide, paint, batteries, and textile. If you look at the environmental implication of the chemical, plastic, pesticide, paint, batteries, and textile, then what we see that it damages the rivers, it damages the ocean, it damages the water courses, and it spoils the heaps, and in a way it tries to create the damage to the entire ecosystem. So the damages are very catastrophic, and in view of its catastrophic damages which are being produced by the hazardous waste, the environmental effect appears to be that the unsafe disposal of the hazardous waste, that includes the groundwater contamination, because it percolates down to the aquifer, it percolates down to water table, it tries to have the constant seepage, and that seepage result to a severe contamination of all the water bodies. It also have a burning effect, creating air pollution, and it ultimately is a formidable threat to the natural resources, including the biodiversity. Thus, we see that the environmental implications of the hazardous waste are far-reaching consequences on the natural resources and as well as biodiversity. Therefore, that there is a need to have an assessment of the ecological damages, and we have to see that the quantum of air pollution by the burning of the hazardous waste creates severe problem of the air pollution and the climate change, and the groundwater contamination along with the salinity of the soil and the soil degradation creates a serious problem for agriculture of the world. Thus, taken as a whole, that what has been created, it poses a serious threat to human health, and it tries to see that its impact, it's a ripple impact, it's a multiplier impact on the food chain, its ripple effect on the food chain, and its impact on the health and the public health are very disastrous, and that's why the presence of any chemical and the waste is very toxic, very poisonous, very corrosive, very flammable, very explosive, very infectious, and it is toxic inherently in nature. Thus, it requires a complete understanding and a complete law or a comprehensive law to combat the ill effect and the deleterious impact of the hazardous waste. The definition of the hazardous waste, as we generally try to see that we have already outlined the environmental implication of the hazardous waste, and we have reached to certain category and sorts of the hazardous waste. But to be very careful, we try to understand what is the definition of the hazardous waste. So in that way, the European Directive 1991 is a very handy document which defines hazardous waste, and it says that any substance or object which the producer or the person in possession of it discards or intends or is required to discard. The substances include exceptions are defined and scheduled to these regulations. Then this is the hazardous waste which any person do not consider it to keep in possession and essentially has a habit to discard, and it is no more required, is called a hazardous substances. On the other hand, the first definition which has been handed down by the European Directive of 1991, we have a definition by the UK Department of Environment which defined hazardous waste by its toxicity, its persistence in the environment, and the bioaccumulation tendencies which create potential hazards by its concentration in the food chain, and then it is tried to affect the entire chemicalization of the body. In this context, we see that the hazardous waste as defined by the Hazardous Waste Management and Handling Rule in the Indian context, that is also important, because it defines the waste which poses health and environmental risk. The Indian law also tried to approach the definition of the hazardous waste, and it says that it poses a health and environmental risk due to physical, chemical, reactive, poisonous, combustible, explosive, and corrosive properties as it has been defined, as we have understood that it is this nature and this nature of the physical, chemical, reactive, poisonous, combustible, explosive, and corrosive property is something has been found in Indian notification on hazardous waste, and we see that the enumeration of the European directive and the UK Department of Environment, the Indian definition of the hazardous waste also is very comprehensive in its coverage and outreach. Thus, we try to see that what has been permeated into the definitional aspect of the hazardous waste in the European directive, in the UK Department of Environment, and the Indian hazardous waste rule definition, we try to go a straightway to its parent enactment from where the India have drawn sustenance and life breath in framing the hazardous waste management and handling rules 1989 is the Basel Convention of 1989, Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of the Hazardous Waste. It defined hazardous waste under Article 1.1 A and B, and let us see that how the Basel Convention tried to approach. They say that they belong to the category contained in Annex 1 unless they do not possess any of the characteristics contained in Annex 3. So, the typology of the definition which has been adopted was inductive and deductive method of definition has been adopted by the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of 1989, and then it tries to see that they are listed in Annex 1 or they are defined or considered to be hazardous by the domestic legislation. So, it has tried to give a very general and the generic definition as it has explained and illustrated under the Annex 1, Annex 3, and then it tries to leave the entire question of assumption and consideration of the hazardous waste on the domestic legislation and parties to see that how they are going to define in regard to the hazardous waste, including management, handling, export, import, transit, transportation. And in this way, we see that what has been done in the Basel Convention, India seems very justified under the Hazardous Waste Management and Handling Rule 1989 to define the health and the environmental risk arising out of the physical, chemical, reactive, poisonous, combustible, explosive, and corrosive properties of the hazardous waste. Having understood this definition, we are switching over to the categories of the hazardous waste which has been identified under the Basel Convention 1989, then the Annex 1, Annex 2, Annex 3, which encompasses, as it has been mentioned, under Article 1.1a, and this has been passed under Article 1.1a and b. So, what has been said under Article 1.1a and b under the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of the Hazardous Waste, let us see that what has been laid down in the Annex 1, Annex 2, Annex 3 in order to draw a very comprehensive perspective of the hazardous waste. It says that the waste stream, hospital and pharmaceutical wastages, organic waste and solvent, polychlorinated biphenyls, adhesive waste, waste constituent, it has two categories. The one category is this, another category is that the waste constituent, the one is defined in terms of a stream, one has been defined in terms of the constituent which lead to lead, mercury, asbestos waste are considered to be hazardous unless do not possess any of the characteristic as it has been mentioned into Annex 3. So, the definition in the Annex 1 in regard to the hazardous waste tries to see that what waste streams are there and there it have identified hospital and pharmaceutical waste, organic waste, and adhesive waste, and polychlorinated biphenyls, and on the other category it defines the waste as a constituent which leads to lead, mercury, asbestos, unless they are considered to be hazardous in terms of NX3. So now we see that what has been defined into the category of NX2 is a household waste, that is ash from the incineration of the household waste, and it also try to see that what has been defined under the importing agreement or exporting agreement by the domestic legislation, and that is left to the wisdom and the sagacity of the domestic countries or the domestic jurisdictions and their member state to define the household waste and other kinds of the waste. On the other hand, the last category is the next third, which tries to define explosive, flammable, liquid, and solid waste, and substances likely to have a spontaneous combustion and toxic and ecotoxic waste. So, the categories which have been identified into Annex 1, waste constituent that may be lead, mercury, and asbestos, they can be considered as hazardous waste only if it satisfies this criteria of something that it happens to be explosive, flammable, and solid waste and have a spontaneous combustion, toxic and ecotoxic waste. Thus, we see that the definition which has been permeated under Article 1.1a and b of the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of the Hazardous Waste 1989 is comprehensive in giving effect to the very definition of the hazardous waste. Having understood the entire notion, concept, and categories and classification and environmental implication of the hazardous waste, we are switching over to having a panoramic perception of the international legal framework on the hazardous waste. In that category, we see that a Stockholm Declaration and as well as the Rio Declaration happens to work on transboundary movement of the hazardous waste, as well as it try to see the precautionary principles and apply the compensatory liability principle in matters of any kind of a damages which is crossing the frontiers of the two nations or the transboundary movement. So, in this case, we see that in India we have a case relating to the Irish radiation case where the butters were said to be radiated because of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster which happened in Russia. So, the transboundary movement of the radioactive waste is very important, and we must try to see that how this law is going to take place in the Indian context or in any domestic context. So, the starting point is obviously the Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment 1972 with 1992 Rio Declaration, which have a specific provisions of containing the transboundary movement and as well as setting some kind of the liability principles which are mentioned there. So, in both the declaration we have a clear reference, but certainly the most vociferous conception and conceptualization and comprehension of the hazardous waste is given under the Basel Convention, and as we have taken note of its definition under Article 1.1a and b, which defines the hazardous waste in terms of NX1, NX2, NX3. We find Loam Convention and the Bamko Convention both happens to be, the Bamko Convention was passed in the wake of the African nations, so it has a kind of a regional import and application, whereas the Loam Fourth Convention is very important on the issue of the Basel Convention. If any convention happens to be very important, it is the one what we can say, and we will conclude on the lecture that we are here prefacing and pre-noting is the fact the BRS, the B stands for Basel, R stands for the Rotterdam Convention on prior informed consent for certain hazardous chemical and pesticide in the international trade of 1990, and then the Stockholm, S for Stockholm, R for Rotterdam, B for Basel. So the at least though there are a large number of conventions, large numbers of large numbers of the guidelines and declarations regarding the containment of the transboundary movement of the hazardous waste and the regulation of the hazardous waste, but for the purpose to be very suffice and succinct, we must remember the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, and the Stockholm Convention. Nonetheless, we are going to discuss the 1992 law, which deals with protocol on liability and compensation for damages resulting in the transboundary movement of the hazardous waste and their disposal 1992, which is a liability and compensation a specific law. The BAMCO is an overarching legislation. Basel is an overarching legislation. So the BAMCO is having a regional focus of African state. Loam Convention also try to locate the hazardous waste in a very different context. And then we have a protocol on liability and compensation arising from the transboundary movement of the hazardous waste in 1992. And then we have a Rotterdam Convention on prior informed consent, PIC, for certain hazardous chemical and pesticide in international trade. So it deals with international trade aspect. So the trade aspect is here. One, the liability aspect is here, compensation, the trade aspect is here. So we must see that the range and the sweep of international legal framework in recognizing and devoting this legal regulation right from very definition, right from the transboundary movement, right from the precautionary principles, right from the polluter pays principles in Stockholm and the Rio Declaration. It is touching on each and every segment of the legal control of the hazardous substances as it has been exhibited in matters of protocol on liability and compensation, as it has been glaring in case of the Rotterdam Convention on prior informed consent in regard to the international trade, regarding the hazardous chemical and pesticide international trade, and the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutant 2001. As we have seen into the reference that the one is the Basel, another is a Rotterdam, and the third is the Stockholm when we said about the BRF. So these three are very important. The one it talking about the PIC in regard to the hazardous chemical and pesticide in relation to international trade, and it talks about persistent organic chemicals, the Stockholm Declaration Convention 2001, and we find that Chemical Weapon Convention, or we can say the International Convention on Prevention of Pollution from Ship, is also very important, because although we have a law relating to UN clause, United Nations Convention on Law of Sea 1981, but we see that most of the hazardous waste are being dumped in the sea, and that's why the International Convention for Prevention of Pollution from Ship, MARPOL, is a very important convention which strategically approach the international chemical management, and its refinement happens to be in the strategic approach to international chemical management 2002. And lastly, we can discuss about the Hyogo framework of action 2005 to 2015 in relation to uh, international legal framework on the hazardous waste. Let us try to discuss some of the basic essence of each law which we have just prefaced and just enumerated in this slide. We will see that the Stockholm Declaration 1972 and the Rio Declaration 1992 have protected the integrity of the global environment in the context of environmentally vulnerable country. So the countries are the eastern nations, or you can say the southern nation, or the African nation. And what is this concept is the concept of NIMBY, which is applied generally in the concept of the hazardous waste. That is that the thumb rule of the legal framework of the hazardous waste not in my backyard. NIMBY principle. So that NIMBY principle is very important, and NIMBY principle is being reflected in this Stockholm Declaration and the Rio Declaration 1992, which says that it tries to protect that the vulnerable countries in matters of transboundary movement of hazardous waste. It also talks about the protocol on liability for damage is resulting from transboundary movement of the hazardous waste and their disposal. It is very important which try to see the question of the liability and the compensation are the two major themes, and the Loam Convention has banned hazardous waste export. So the one, as we have seen, that talking about the international trade, Rotterdam, and the Loam talks about the banning of the hazardous waste export, and then the BAMCO is something dealing with the African country in matters of strict control, liability, and environment protection across the continent. Thus, we see that it tries to contain the radioactive waste and indiscriminate dumping of the hazardous waste into vulnerable countries, and much vulnerable country is the African countries and the Asian countries. And this law is very important, which not only try to define and regulate, but it directly hit the question of the liability and paying of the compensation resulting from the damage of the transboundary movement and by illegal trafficking of the hazardous waste. We have a Chemical Convention, Weapon Convention 1997, which bans development of production, stockpiling, transfer and use of chemical weapons, ensuring the destruction under strict international verification and compliance regime. It talks about corrosive and explosive hazardous waste, whereas the Rotterdam Convention, which is based on the prior informed consent and both the country in matters of having trade of the hazardous waste, it should not be without the consent, and it tries to see that how a very transparent information system and exchange is going to happen at the international level in matters of the hazardous waste. And it should not be only what we can say that it should not be, it should strictly follow again the NIMBY principle, must be prior informed consent, that it should not be indiscriminately to be dumped in African and Asian state. Whereas the Stockholm Convention 2001 have created a kind of atmosphere of having protecting human health and environment. That was the concern which are resulting from the persistent organic pollutant POP, and we have a strategic plan of the Hyogo Framework for Action 2005 to 2015, which tried to see that the global disaster risk strategy in ensuring resilience, preparedness, early warning system, and institutional capacity in regard to the hazardous waste. Then we see that the Basel Convention, which is one of the very front runner convention in regard to in regard to the management and regulation of the hazardous waste, it casts obligations and prohibition under Article 13 of the convention, and it tries to adopt a prior informed consent as it has been reflected in the Rotterdam Convention, or what we can say the Stockholm Convention both. So it is logical extension of Article 13 of the Basel Convention on transboundary hazardous waste. The Rotterdam Convention is very important in the sense that Article 10 of the Rotterdam Convention talks about the PIC procedure, as we have just discussed about it, and it follows the NIMBY principles. And following the NIMBY principles under the Rotterdam Convention, it is something very important that it tries to see a very transparent system. Whereas Article 13 talks about information and labeling, Article 14 talks about non-confidential information, Article 15 tries to underline the emission registries, and Article 15 talks to access to information to operate the entire procedure of the prior informed consent, as it has been mentioned under Article 13 of the Basel Convention and Article 10 of the Rotterdam Convention. With this, we see that the Stockholm Convention, which is another milestone in this context, try to see the persistent and organic chemical pollutant of 2001, how it is going to be solved in the category of the hazardous waste, and its incorporation of the persistent organic chemical and its harmful impact on the human health and the environment is addressed in the Stockholm Convention. Therefore, what we can pull out of the entire discussion of the international legal framework, that ultimately it is Basel, ultimately it is Rotterdam, ultimately it is Stockholm, which creates a kind of a triangle. And this triangle is the one hand the Basel, another has the Rotterdam, another hand is the Stockholm. Taken together, it talks about all these three conventions have a very broad consensus of management of hazardous waste, persistent organic, persistent and organic chemicals, and we see that how the persistent and organic chemicals and the prior informed consent happens to be going to be regulated under this category of under the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, and as well as the Stockholm Convention. So the BRS syndrome and synergy is very important, and it is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Conference of Parties approach have also been ratified, the Rotterdam, Stockholm, and the Basel Convention. So all these three happens to be of a great help and rescue in visualizing the entire notion and concept of the management of the hazardous waste. Although we have BAMCO Convention, we have Loam Convention, and we have a catena of the convention, but for our understanding in a very succinct and a brief manner, we must know that what are the environmental implications of the hazardous waste. We must know what is the definitional ambit and scope of the hazardous waste. We must know what are the categories of the hazardous waste, and we must have a bird's eye view of the international legal framework, and then we must realize that what has been laid down in each and every conventions and protocol and declaration, and finally we will try to be more careful in understanding the three convention on the point which is known as the BRS syndrome and the synergy, that is the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, and to see that how it is going to the trinity and the triangular approach of these three conventions is going to help in the conference of parties to contain into the regulation of the hazardous waste, and as at the same time trying to foster the sustainable development goals in the world, and to see that there must be safe and very careful handling of the hazardous waste and the processes, and it needs to be regulated at the domestic context. With this, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.